Wednesday greetings, everybody. Oh, I have everybody's attention today. Any questions before we start? Questions about courseworks 1, 2, or 3? I am working hard on assessing coursework 1. I think the average is somewhere around a 35 so far. Just kidding. No, I think the average is around a 67-ish. So it's kind of it's kind of what I expected. Yeah. Nothing unexpected has happened. Let's say nothing unusual. Business as usual, let's say. Question?
Have you had any incredible videos that have absolutely blown you away?
Yes, I had so far some really, really good ones, and they're on the YouTube channel for this module.
I mean from this year?
Yes, they're on the YouTube channel. So 2 of them, yes. I uploaded them. You obviously haven't subscribed. Any other questions? Okay. So today we're going to talk about writing literature reviews, one of my favorite topics. And it's very much about coursework 3. So today you want to keep this in mind for coursework 3. Because it will help you, well, hopefully it will help you. Hopefully it will help you with coursework 3. So the way this is organized, writing a literature review, a good quality literature review is difficult. I'm not going to advertise this as being easy. Reading research papers and extracting the essentials, identifying the essential information is not an easy skill. Data visualization is not an easy skill. It's a difficult skill. Like serious data visualization involves software engineering, mathematics, and computer graphics. It's very, very rare to find a person with those 3 skills. And then writing a good quality literature survey is also quite difficult. Now, I could say the other way around too. Writing a very low quality literature survey is not difficult. But writing a good quality one is difficult. And it involves different phases, like different activities. Some of the activities are preparation oriented. So they're kind of like things you might do before you start writing. And then there are actual phases where you're writing and you're trying to figure out what to write. So I've tried to organize the different activities into preparation and writing, but they don't work exactly like that in practice. In practice, it's a little bit more agile, like the agile software engineering process. This looks like the waterfall method of writing a literature survey. It's not it's not a waterfall method process. It's more of an agile process. It's not just follow these steps. It's more like iterate these steps. Hope that makes sense. So these are the different activities that we're going to talk about. Some of them are preparation oriented and some of them are writing oriented. So the big question is, why is this important? Why do we even care about literature surveys? By the way, chapter 2 of your thesis is a literature survey. And what we're really hoping is that your literature survey for this module is the start of your literature survey for your thesis. So we are hoping that you communicate with your supervisors about this and they directly overlap. So you are literally starting your thesis now. You're not waiting until June, you're starting it in April, for example. So so the goal of a literature survey is to determine solved and unsolved problems in research with the objective of working on an unsolved problem. Question?
So some of them are doing 2 years, and some of us, we're doing 2 years, and we're starting our dissertation like later in September.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
With what you're saying,
Yeah, so in that case, you have two options. You can pretend that you don't have a supervisor and just go on your own. That's fine. But in your coursework, you would write, I'm a 2-year extended MSc student. I haven't been allocated. Or you could actually try to find one and engage. So you have two options. Yeah. So the goal is to determine solved and unsolved problems with the goal of working on an unsolved problem. That's the goal. You don't have to work on an unsolved problem. It's not a requirement, but it's nice. It's nice to work on something new. It's nice to expand. It's to make a contribution to knowledge, right? If you're doing something that's already solved, you might not be making some contribution to knowledge. And one of the caveats is a very large volume of previous literature exists. This is one of the reasons why a literature review is so challenging, because of the sheer volume of previous literature. So keeping up with the literature explosion has been a top challenge for any researcher for a very long time. But it's really, really difficult. This is a big problem. And so we're going to talk about how we can navigate through this massive complexity and how can we determine unsolved problems to work on. This is partially what this lecture is talking about. In order to find the unsolved problems, we need to find the solved problems. That's the basic idea. So some of the things we want to think about in our survey is what has been published already. How are the publications related to each other? In other words, how do they fit together in the grand scheme of things? Hopefully this reminds you a little bit of coursework 1, by the way. Have pathways of future research already been suggested? So usually at the end of a research paper, there are some suggestions for future work in unsolved problems. You can think about how your survey will make a unique contribution. This is not a strict requirement, but if you do a good job on your survey, it can make a unique contribution. You could be working on something brand new that nobody's ever worked on, and if you do it correctly, it can be a unique contribution. Some of the things that you'll investigate are what have researchers used and which appear best, which methodologies. And how does your topic, the one you chose, fit in the larger landscape of previous work? So these are all challenging questions that you want to address in your literature survey. So the survey is a good way to obtain an overview of the previous literature. That's one of the purposes, to get an overview of the previous literature on a given topic. And also find the solved and unsolved problems. So every research paper proposes to have solved some problem, and you want to see what those solved problems are. And in doing so, you can infer or see some of the unsolved problems. Of course, it's not a requirement to publish it. This is more for like PhD students. So I will teach this same topic to PhD students, and I will encourage them to publish their surveys. if you write a PhD in visualization, you have to publish your survey. It's not an option. So all the PhD students that do visualization publish their surveys. And just a warning, to be clear, a good literature survey is difficult to write and poses a number of challenges. So I'm not going to advertise this as an easy exercise, because I'm tight. Why is it not very easy? This is kind of a summary of why it's not easy and some of the challenges that we overcome or address when we work on a survey. One is the vast amount of published literature. So you might have noticed already from coursework 1 that there's a vast amount of previously published literature. In coursework 1, you were asked to identify a research paper and summarize it, and you had to go through a lot of different research papers. If you have a staff member at the School of Computer Science here, they may have published 100 papers. It's very possible. And if there are 100 papers and there are 50 staff members, that's 5,000 papers just in the School of Computer Science at the University of Nottingham. 5,000 papers. Now multiply that by all the academics across the world. You end up with millions of papers. Millions. Right? This is one of the challenges. Choosing a starting point. Where do you start? Any ideas on where to start when you look at a literature? Any ideas already? Keywords. That's not bad. If you search for topics with keywords, will you run into any problems?
Oh, and also like a time span. So you don't get rid of stuff.
Yep, a time span is not bad. Any other ideas? Using keywords, time spans, choosing a starting point. Any ideas? We're going to keep talking about this, by the way. We are going to address all of these questions today. Talk to your supervisor. That's a good starting point. Because you're new to this business, right? If you're new to the business, then how are you supposed to know where to start? You don't. You're not expected to know exactly where to start. That's what a supervisor is for. Right? What is a supervisor even for? Right? That's one of the things that they're for. Deciding on a topic, so these are very closely related. We also call this scope, and we're going to explain that in more detail. How to perform a search, the search methodology. We already went over this. We already had a workshop on searching for literature, so you're all experts in this already. How to navigate the individual papers. You're all experts at this now already because of coursework 1, because we're using coursework 1 as part of our literature review. This part is tricky. Deriving a classification of literature. That's one of the topics for today. And then determining unsolved problems. So 6 and 7 are topics for today. 1, 2, and 3 are topics for today. 4 and 5 are topics we've already covered. So keep that in mind. So we're not going to really be talking about 4 and 5 today. We're going to be talking about 1, 2, 3, 6, and 7. So this is about the preparation. Deciding on the scope of a literature survey is very challenging. What do we mean by scope? Anybody know what a scope is? Just as a noun, the traditional noun, the word scope. A scope is a kind of lens They're usually round. Lenses are usually round. Not always, but usually. And you look through them. So we're talking, this is a metaphor obviously, but it's a metaphor for how big is the lens that you're looking at the previous literature through. If your lens is too big and you're looking at the previous literature, you'll be looking at millions of papers, and you cannot summarize millions of papers. That's not possible. And then if your lens is too small, you might miss some papers, right? Has anybody seen England's smallest window? Has anybody seen that? It's like this big. It's a peephole, basically. Anyway, so that's different. If your lens is too small, you might miss some paper. So the question is, how big should your scope be? Your lens through which you view the previous. I know that's a little bit abstract, but that's what we're talking about. And it's difficult to decide on the scope of a literature survey. So this is another thing that you need to discuss with a supervisor. It's very helpful because a supervisor will be able to tell you, oh, that scope is too broad, or that scope is too narrow. A supervisor will know the answer to that question. Some more guidelines. We choose a scope that you think is too narrow to start with. So when you're trying to decide on a topic, it's better to decide on a topic that's too narrow. A very specific scope, rather than one that's too big, too broad. So, for example, I remember in one of the workshops in this class, somebody found a survey called like a survey of artificial intelligence literature. I remember we saw that in one of the workshops. That's an example of a scope that is way too broad. There's no way you can write a literature survey on a survey of artificial intelligence. Not possible. But what could be possible? Something like a survey of artificial intelligence methods in the context of data visualization with a special focus on time-varying data. That might be a good focus. So you have artificial intelligence combined with data visualization combined with time-oriented data. So you have those three topics combined as a more narrow focus. And by the way, you can ask me, you can say, Bob, I have this idea for a literature survey. Is it too broad, or is it a good, narrow enough focus? And I'll give you my opinion. Some more guidelines. You can do a preliminary search. How many papers are you finding on your chosen topic? If it's too many, then you narrow the scope. I don't know what happened here. If it's too many, what happened there? So, for example, like greater than, n greater than, 100, narrow the scope. If you find too many papers on your topic, you need to narrow the scope. So you can do a preliminary search. And then for coursework 3, you're aiming for 10 papers. N equals 10, where n is the number of papers. And as another guideline, you search for existing surveys on your topic first. So I remember that was one of the workshop tasks. In one of the workshops, you were given a special task to search for existing surveys on a given topic. I don't remember exactly which workshop that was. Does anybody remember which workshop that was? I think it was the How to Search for Papers workshop. Pretty sure. So it was a little bit workshop number 2 or 3. And when you're writing, you include a description of your survey scope in the introduction. This survey or this literature review focuses on the following topic. And you say what's in there. And you also say what's not included. By the way, there's lots of extra help for this, but we already had, I'm just reminding you, we already had a lecture on search methodology, and it's in the playlist for research methods. It's in there already, right? Research methods, finding relevant research papers. So we're not talking about that today, but it's part of the literature survey process, just so you know. I just want to refresh your memory. So we talked about scope a little bit. We talked about searching for papers, and now we're talking about the survey contributions. Contributions are like, what does your survey provide to the reader in terms of knowledge? Like, what are the benefits that the reader has to look at your survey? Why should anybody read your survey? Do they gain any benefits from it? Does it contribute to knowledge somehow? You want to actually describe this. So some typical literature survey contributions are like the following. So it could be the first literature survey on a given topic. You might be the first person to cover a special topic. For that to be true, you have to do a search for previous surveys on your topic and make sure that nobody else has covered that topic. And that might be something you chose with your supervisor. This is not a requirement, by the way. It's a requirement to list your contributions, but it's not a requirement to be the first survey on a given topic. That's not a requirement. You might contribute a novel classification of the literature on a given topic. So as part of the exercise, you have to put your research papers into groups, 2 or 3 groups, and then figure out what those groups are going to be and why they make sense. That's something we're going to talk about today. And another typical contribution is it provides a valuable starting point for anybody studying that topic, including yourself, right? This is really for you guys. It's an educational exercise so you get familiar with your own topic in your dissertation or a topic, right? Also, another contribution might be an updated version of a previous survey. So some surveys, they get outdated over time. You can take a given topic that's already been published 10 or more years ago and refresh it, update the same topic. That's a typical contribution of a survey. The most highly cited paper, I don't know if it's the most highly cited paper in the world, but it's definitely the most highly cited paper in physics, is a survey paper that is periodically renewed. I don't know if anybody's ever seen that before, but there's a survey of subatomic particles in physics, and that's renewed like every 5 or 10 years or something, and it is the #1 cited paper in all of physics. So, writing research field challenges. So if you have chosen a topic and you've chosen a scope, you want to also try to summarize the typical research challenges associated with that topic. And this is what we're calling research field challenges. So there are a set of typical challenges associated with your topic. The question is, what are those typical associated challenges? You want to identify those and articulate those. So discuss the challenges associated with a research conducted on topic T. These are just some generic examples. Size and complexity of data. This is a very common challenge. Right? A lot of computer science research papers are dealing with very large data sets, and those large data sets are challenging. They could be challenging in terms of processing power or processing time. They may take a long time or a lot of resources to process. And this is true this is a very, very common research challenge, right? In the context of AI, a lot of those machine learning algorithms, right, they want labeled images, and to manually correctly label 10,000 images is very challenging. Right? As a training data set, very, very challenging. A very common challenge in the scientific literature is heterogeneous data. So heterogeneous data refers to data coming from more than one source. An example might be electronic health records. Electronic health records have images in them, or might contain images. They might contain letters, like written letters. They might contain prescription information, diagnosis information, and so on. Errors and uncertainty, right? Errors and uncertainty are a very common challenge associated with the scientific literature. All data sets have some sort of error and uncertainty, all of them. And trying to handle this or deal with it or represent it in a constructive way is a challenge, very, very common challenge. The cost of conducting experiments or expensive equipment, those are challenges, very, very common field challenges. Whatever topic you choose will have its own set of challenges, so you try to identify what those challenges are. This is a generic list that applies to a lot of the previous published literature. Your list will be a little bit more focused, will be a little bit less generic. So your challenges can be described more specifically to your topic, but these are some examples. Does that make sense to everybody? Research field challenges. I noticed last year this was a stumbling point for a lot of students. When they submitted their literature survey, a lot of them struggled with this aspect. And when you identify a research field challenge, you want to cite the paper or papers that identify that as a challenge. How do you find out the research field challenges? The research field challenges are usually described in the introduction of every research paper. The first paragraph of every research paper is usually describing challenges. The first, or definitely the first or second, but it's usually the first paragraph. Okay, now we're going to talk about the literature classification. So as part of coursework 3, you want to group those 10 papers into different categories. And they should be somehow logical. It shouldn't be a random selection of random papers to random groups. Somehow you want to figure out, okay, how can these be classified or categorized? You want to create categories. This is just an example. This is a survey paper, right? It's called Visualization for the Physical Sciences. These are all papers that are included in the survey. And they've all been classified somehow because they have something in common. So this is a 3-dimensional classification, which is very advanced. You're not required to make a 3-dimensional classification. Like, that's not a requirement. Some of you will, which is good, but it's not required. It's just an example to show you like the highest level, kind of the best possible classification you could do. On the x-axis is the subject. So this is the physical sciences. The subjects, astronomy, chemistry, earth science, and physics are covered. So that's one of the categories. Each paper belongs to one of those categories along the x-axis. And then on the y-axis, there's the dimensionality of the input data. Remember in coursework 1? The input data characteristics? There it is. It's appearing. All the puzzle pieces are fitting together now. The reason we asked you to identify the input data characteristics is exactly for this task. Yeah. So this is the dimensionality of the input data. In this case, the data is spatial. So it could be 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional. And then it has a time dimension too. Is it static? In other words, it doesn't depend on time, or is it time dependent? So now I can look at this classification and say, oh, I'm interested in a paper, a physics paper that deals with 3D time-dependent data. And boom, that's what all of these have in common. They all are in the field of physics, and they all process 3-dimensional time-dependent data. That's what they all have in common. That's just an example. Oh, by the way, I forgot the color. So there's color. That's the 3rd dimension. So the color identifies the main challenges addressed in each paper. So that's quite advanced, right? It could be multi-field visualization, graphics, hardware, feature detection, scalable visualization, time-dependent visualization, uncertainty visualization, or global versus local visualization, and so on, comparative visualization. So, yeah, that's quite an advanced classification. So I know that this one right here happens to be a feature detection topic. So it's physics, time-dependent data, 3-dimensional data, and it addresses feature detection. This one, and this one. Question?
So would you recommend that we do this 3D classification for our thesis, or does it depend on what our project is?
It depends on your project. Yes. This is just an example. Yeah, before I jump into the guidelines. So these are the actual guidelines. This is not easy. To do a good job, it doesn't have to be very difficult, but to do a good job, it's not easy. So this is deriving a literature classification is one of the major challenges. It classifies or categorizes each paper such that similar papers fall into the same groups or group. And then deriving the groups, categories, and dimensions for your classification requires some thought. By the way, you can ask me as well. Like, you can say, Bob, I have this idea. Do you think this will work? And I can give you my opinion. Yeah. Categories are often based on subtopics, reoccurring themes, data, or metadata attributes. So the data is one possibility, like the characteristics of the input data. That is a possibility. Like, that could be a dimension you use. You might want to look at themes or subtopics that reoccur over and over again. That's what this list was. These are themes that keep reoccurring. So that's why we use those. Are there any natural subject-based clusters? A tool called surveys can help with this. So actually in coursework 3, you'll be asked to use a tool called surveys. What are some of the characteristics that most, if not all, papers you have in common, right? Same or different types of data. So data is a very common categorization dimension. Subtopics are also a very common classification dimension. Those are probably the two most common. Here's another example. Again, it's a three-dimensional example. So on the x-axis, we have the kind of geometric, or the kind of geometry that we're outputting, that the algorithm outputs. So these first four columns all output curves, one-dimensional curves. So this one is one-dimensional curves on a 2D plane, on surfaces in 3 dimensions, and in 3D, and again in 3D. These papers all output surfaces, and these papers all output volumes. And then on the y-axis, we have the data again. Steady, static data, or time-dependent data, also called unsteady. So I can look at this paper and say, okay, I know that this paper outputs 2D curves for unsteady or time-dependent data. And the topic is for seeding strategies or placement. That's another word for placement, which you're not expected to know what that means at this point. So there are 3 dimensions. And by the way, look, there's an empty hole here. There's an empty hole. Anybody know what that empty hole represents?
Unsolved problem?
Exactly. What's your name?
Thomas.
Thomas. Well done. Unsolved problems. That's an unsolved problem right there. It's staring you in the face. Oh my gosh, nobody has solved this problem yet. Let's do it. Let's kick some butt and solve that problem. Look, unsolved problems. This would be considered an unsolved problem too. And guess what? If I was a PhD supervisor, I would say, let's not work on this, because a lot of people have worked on this already. Let's work on something that's unsolved. You know, maybe here, for example. Right? Unsolved problem. And guess what? Like, this is actually what my PhD thesis worked on. So, surfaces. Yeah. So that's one way to help identify the unsolved problems. This is just an example of like a so-called metadata figure. So you need to include a metadata figure in your survey. What is this one? This is a hierarchy of literature. This is a paper. Each node in this graph, in this hierarchy, represents a paper that's been published. And then this is the so-called parent. This is another paper, and this is the parent of this paper. Remember in coursework 1, where you were to identify the most important 1 or 2 previously published papers based on the one you chose? Well, for this particular paper, this is the most important previously published paper. This paper builds on this paper, and that's why there's an edge from here to here. So this paper was published after this one, and it builds on that one. That's what those edges mean. And then the same thing here. This paper builds on this one. That's why there's an edge. So I can trace back the history, or the sort of the history and the relationship between these papers, and I can represent it as a graph, like in this particular case. So, and this graph summarizes how all these papers are related. So this paper, for example, took a 2D algorithm And then it extended it to surfaces. That's what this 2.5D means, surfaces. So it took the original, extended it to 2D surfaces, but then someone took this one and extended it to surfaces in time-dependent data. So somebody said, okay, I can take this 2D algorithm, I can extend it to surfaces, and then I can take this surface-based algorithm and I can incorporate unsteady data. So that you can see the contribution in just visualized, right, as a visual representation. So this is what the outline of your survey can look like. This is sort of what you're expected to produce for coursework 3. You have an introduction and motivation section that mentions your contributions. You describe the challenges associated with your topic. You just describe the survey scope. You describe the search methodology, which you're already familiar with. That's a topic you've already conquered. Classification of literature and organization is one of the subsections. Metadata, so there's a metadata figure in there. And then there are paper summaries, so that's where you actually summarize the papers that you include in your literature review. And your classification introduces groups, so it could be group A, B, and C. So for each group, you have a subsection of papers according to category A. I could make this a little bit clearer. Categories A, B, etc. So you have a subsection according to category A and another subsection according to category B. And you might have more. You might have more than 2 subsections. Does that look exciting? It is exciting. I don't really understand why, but for some reason I like this topic. And I'm always working on a survey paper, always. Like I'm working on a survey paper right now, like always. These are some survey papers. If you want to see what some previous survey papers look like, there are some there. And yeah, so if you want to see some more examples. Any questions about that? It's kind of a lot of information. We can just look at coursework 3 for a few minutes before we finish. So your literature review is an abridged one because you're only really asked for 10 to classify and summarize 10 papers. A full one would be more like maybe 30 or 50, right? But yours is an abridged one. So look, half of the module, 50% of the module. Questions, if you have questions, you can ask them in class, after class. We're also going to have drop-in sessions, by the way, if anybody noticed. And on the Teams chat for the module, right? That's to manage the questions. So, it looks like I'm being redundant here, so I can actually remove that. That's being redundant. So choose a topic. That's the idea. Summarize each paper. There's a little section here on if you're struggling to find research papers. This is some guidance. There's some guidance for year 2 students there, by the way. Someone asked about a year 2 student. If you don't have a supervisor because you're a 2-year enhanced MSc student, then start with a recent survey paper on the topic you have chosen. You can also look for highly cited papers on your topic in recent publications. You can discuss your topic with Bob to see if it's appropriate. You can also discuss with a potential supervisor. This is actually the best solution. Yep. There's some extra help. We set the world record for the most extra help ever in a module. This is clearly a world record setting amount of material. You summarize your research papers, right? Similar to coursework 1. Don't forget the type of evaluation. By the way, the type of evaluation can also be a literature categorization. So you could have, I don't know, some topic and you say, well, all these papers have a user study as their evaluation. All these papers have an accuracy assessment as part of their evaluation. That's a good way to classify papers. Okay, extra help on summarizing research papers. There's the categorization. This is a new aspect for you guys. This is challenging. There's some extra help on class categorization. You actually use a literature browser in your coursework 3. It's called Surveys. And it's a tool that helps you organize your literature. It's a visual tool. This is what it looks like. So you actually set up a web page of your literature according to Surveys. A lot of people last year lost points on this aspect of the coursework. And I'm guessing a lot of people will lose points this year on this aspect. Common ways to lose points are not completing all the information that it asks for. So some people will provide a screenshot and there'll be like question marks with missing information, like something will be empty here or something will be empty here. Another common error is not having the URL to the live web page. So a lot of people will submit this and then the URL will not work. So we click on the URL to see if it's working, and if it doesn't work, then you lose points. Very common. And you include a supplementary figure. This is an example of a supplementary figure. Oops. It just shows the year on the x-axis and then the number of papers on the y-axis that were published on your topic in that year. So for example, in 2017, there are 2 papers published on visualization literacy in that year. One was done in a classroom and one was a crowdsourced experiment. And then you have a list of references, right? You're familiar with that. And you fill out a template, because you guys know I love templates. I love them. Right? So you fill out the template. The following is the outline of how your literature review is organized. Introduction and motivation, research field challenges, survey scope, search methodology, classification of literature, the paper summaries, subsection paper summaries. Yeah. And there it is. And there's extra help. Questions and answers, more questions and answers, wow. And so on. Any questions?
So you talked about like choosing the topic for literature review. But obviously we sort of will have allocations for research projects which will already sort of have a topic. So is it that for this exercise we choose like a subsection of the research project to investigate, or sort of
You discuss with your supervisor. That's what you do. Yep. That's the step one. I know you don't like that idea of talking to somebody. I know talking to people is no longer in fashion. But we're trying to bring like discussions between people back in fashion. Yeah. But it's up to you. It's up to you. You can, like, if I'm totally honest, you can pretend your supervisor doesn't exist, but you'll lose points. But you can pretend your supervisor doesn't exist and do the literature without them. You'll lose points, but you can still do it. And you don't have to talk to them. But the goal, what I'm hoping for the maximum number of points, is that you talk to your supervisor and you choose a topic with your supervisor. That's the goal. And you start your dissertations. That's the goal. If you ignore your supervisor, and you could do a completely different topic that has nothing to do with your dissertation. And some students will do that. Some will submit surveys that have nothing, but that's not what we're hoping for. We're hoping that you talk to your supervisor and you start your dissertation. That's what we're hoping for. Yeah. Because the quality of your dissertation will then go up. Yeah. The sooner you start, the better the quality will be. And why not? You have to do this for your dissertation anyways. Your dissertation has a chapter 2 and it's called literature review. So if you, let's say you just do it the totally autonomous way, then you'd have to start from scratch again in like June, for example. You'd be starting your literature review all from scratch again. So you'd be creating more work for yourself. Creating more work. Does that make sense? Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, if everybody's happy, we can stop now.
I
Yep.
have one question.
Yep.
So, would you recommend like scheduling a meeting with the supervisor, going through the best way to do the literature review? I mean, this is due in 9th of May, so.
That's right. Yes, that's what I would recommend. Some sort of communication. Yeah. Okay, have a good Wednesday.